right, I think we'll get started and we can dive in. So my name is Diana LeBeau. I'm the Director of District and School Design Programming with the Center for Collaborative Education. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Peter Piazza, Project Director for School Quality Measures at my organization. And we are also joined today by Ashley Carey, a PhD student at UMass Lowell, who is also collaborating with CCE on our school quality measures work. We are really delighted to have you join us today and look forward to having what I hope will be a good discussion through the chat and through other opportunities to interact as the session goes on. The Center for Collaborative Education works with schools, districts, and their communities to increase ownership, equity, and generally just sort of justice and opportunity to reduce systemic racism and transform schools to ensure that all students succeed. As a result, the topic of today's workshop is really close to our hearts because we have done a lot of thinking about what makes a quality school and how to measure a quality school in a way that brings about rather than prevents greater equity in our schools. Want to send a quick welcome to you all, and now I hope that we have most of the people who will be joining us today. So if you don't mind in the chat, just introducing yourself, your name, your role, what organization or district you're representing, and where in the world, I suppose, or in the country you are joining us from. We operate at CCE in the belief that the wisdom is often in the room. We are not the possessors of special wisdom, so we really hope to build on what you all bring today as well. Great, I see some folks are already responding in the chat. By the way, physically, I should add, CCE is coming from, we have two offices, one in Boston and one in LA. We are joining from our Massachusetts area today, but of course from our home offices. I see there's some folks joining us from New York and Virginia. So I'll invite you to keep adding your Utah, great. So I invite you all to keep adding your welcome hellos to the chat and we'll keep going and I'll keep my eyes on our chat. Wow, Texas, California, Florida, all over every corner. That's great. So today we have sort of three goals. We'll be looking at how to think about school quality in our own contexts. And to get there, we'll learn about and engage with some new tools that we've been working on around inclusive and culturally responsive school design and quality assessments. And we hope that these can be inspirations to your own work in your own site. This is our agenda today. I won't pause here for too long, other than to say that you'll hear from each of us over the course of the next just under an hour. And this is sort of an assumption nowadays. We've all been doing all these virtual and Zoom meetings, but I know I'm joining you all with my older son doing first grade in the other room, and I'm sure you all have pets and children and other disruptions happening around you. We really appreciate your time with us today and do understand that we will be flexible together. So to get us started, I want you all to think about a school site that you care about. And I want you to think about an asset of that school site that you'd want a school quality review to capture. Give you a minute to think about this, and I invite you, I know you've all just added your introductions to the chat. I invite you to add to the chat. You don't need to name the school necessarily, but tell us an asset that you would like for a school quality review to capture in this school in your mind. Give us about half a minute.
Looks like we have collaboration between teachers. Someone wrote students from 46 countries. Student voice opportunities.
Great. I'll give you another few seconds to add anything to the chat there. we see this as an opportunity to hear from you all as we continually refine our work as well. So you'll see how a lot of this becomes relevant as we go on.
And we have someone joining us from Los Angeles.
Yeah, colleague Yvonne, nice to hear from you. Great. So I think we'll continue, but please feel free to keep adding to the chat anything you're thinking about in terms of an asset you'd want a school quality review to capture. I know for me, one of the things when I was thinking about my own children's education, and I say this both as an educator and as a parent, I wanted to hear about opportunities for student voice and participation in their own learning. And that became something I found that many school quality reviews did not measure or give me information about. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Peter, to get us started in thinking about where we're coming from here. Do school quality reviews as they currently exist reinforce inequities?
Thanks, Diana. It's really good to be on with you all. Looking forward to hearing from folks about your experiences in schools. To get started with our presentation, Diana mentioned we wanted to dive in with a guiding question that shaped school quality review tools that you'll see in a minute. So as you see on the slide there, do school quality reviews reinforce inequities? And in answering that question, we want to direct your attention to a traditional and what I would call equity neutral teacher professional development tool. It's also used as a basis for traditional school quality review rubrics. One common example of sort of traditional measure is something like Teach Like a Champion by Doug Lamov. I'm sure a lot of folks on the call are familiar. You can see in the picture there, just taken from Teach Like a Champion materials, that there's a person who's demonstrating, teacher who's demonstrating students in the classroom how they should be folding their hands while they're listening to the lecture. Of course, a lot of the teaching here is based on specific rules to maintain teacher control of the classroom. And recent an educational researcher named Delana Horn recently kind of summarized critique of this, saying, Teach Like a Champion looked like a post-Civil War teacher training model that was explicitly designed to maintain racial hierarchy. So let's look at what that teaching model looks like when it comes in the form of a classroom observation rubric. Again, I'll be using another well-known example. This is the class rubric developed by Peachstone out of the University of Virginia. I'm sure folks, if you're not familiar with class, you might be familiar with something like Charlotte Danielson, and these sorts of like what we would call, traditional school quality review rubrics. I pulled a few examples here to kind of illustrate this sort of equity neutral and I would say control-based approach to teaching that may unintentionally reinforce racial inequity. So you'll see from their behavior management indicators, there's an emphasis on compliance. And this is a quote from one of their manuals. The teacher is consistently proactive and monitors the classroom, preventing problem behaviors from developing. Of course, on its surface, that sounds great. Sounds like a classroom you'd want to be in. At the same time, you could also imagine a classroom that scores extremely highly on this aspect of the observation rubric, but does so with punitive measures that are problematic both from a teaching point of view, but also from a racial justice point of view. And then the same idea extends to content as well. This is from the academic content indicator, again on the class rubric, which says nothing explicitly about diversity. So again, here's a quote: class discussion and materials consistently and effectively communicate the essential attributes of concepts and procedures to students. So it's a very procedural way of thinking about learning. Again, you could imagine a classroom that scores very highly on this on the rubric, but does so only reading works by white male authors that have a sort of Eurocentric perspective or Eurocentric, emphasis on content. These beliefs are based on notions of classroom learning that are rooted in the kinds of educational approaches that we ourselves are pushing back against. And in the majority of this presentation, you'll hear examples, or you'll see examples of alternatives And this sort of racially neutral approach to teaching that values a simplified way of measuring schools and school qualities, this also transfers all the way out to something like housing. So I'll take a brief detour there. A recent article in Mother Jones talked about problems related to the Great Schools website, another common sort of feature of our lives in the educational world that folks may be familiar with. Of course, Great Schools relies heavily on test scores to simplify school ratings down to a simple number. And you see there 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10. Of course, parents look at these ratings to decide where they might move or buy houses or where they might send their kids to school. And it's sort of based on this belief that schools are commodities that can be shopped for like cereal. You can see a quote there from the research director of NCIA, quoted in that very article, saying that this in fact is not the case. And of course, when you're oversimplifying schools down to a 2 out of 10 rating or whatever it might be, you're missing something. All schools have strengths. All schools have areas for growth. And in this particular article, NCIA is presented as an alternative that embraces holistic measures of school quality, but also does so in an equity forward, equity explicit sort of way. And sort of on that note, that I'll turn things over to Diana, who will start talking about alternatives.
Yeah, so we started thinking several years ago at CCE about what the alternative might be. Some hallmarks that we saw of a more inclusive and equitable approach to a school quality review was that it includes an approach that elevates diverse perspectives, that the tools in themselves foster an equity lens, that there are multiple measures and many kinds of data that determine quality. Amplitude is a term that we use sometimes, thinking about that balance of breadth and depth without oversimplification. So no single number score is going to give us the nuance that we need. And finally, that they're asset-based and really support the schools in perpetual growth and progress, this idea of continued iteration to continually become stronger and more responsive to their own communities. So with these principles in mind, we've been working in our various corners of our organization and with many schools and districts around Massachusetts and beyond to find a better, more improved system of school quality reviewing. And, this is the child of a longstanding process that we've had at CCE, our SQR process, we called it, that did involve multiple stakeholders. It included multiple data points, artifact reviews, walkthroughs, focus groups, etc. But what we have come to see in our own internal auditing is that in this, equity is implicit. It's rare that the word equity is used, and even though the word equity itself isn't the important thing, many important equity pieces are not included. For example, looking at specifically racial composition of upper level courses, or thinking about whether or not the curriculum itself is representative and inclusive, whether there are multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate their own success and their own learning. Those things that we sort of see as part and parcel with an equitable school weren't necessarily represented in the tool itself. It was dependent on reviewers themselves that would be able to bring that lens to the work. Similarly, our school quality review 1.0 didn't include all of the same principles that we had come to see were central hallmarks of a strong school quality review system that was also equitable. And so we began to work in a few different directions in our organization to find a next option for us. And you'll hear over the course of the rest of this presentation about 3 of the children of that work. One thing is our school quality measures work that Peter will get into in just a minute. That's part of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Educational Assessment. And he'll be able to explain more in detail what that contributes to a school quality review. You'll hear about some nascent work happening in alignment with that to add a walkthrough tool to supplement some of the other measures that are part of SQM. And finally, you'll hear about our aligned work in building for equity, which is around school redesign, but which includes some self-assessment components, which we have designed in order to have a close relationship with the SQM process in highlighting equity and being able to give folks a tool to help them design with that equitable end in mind. So with that, I will turn it back to Peter to tell us a little bit more about school quality measures specifically.
Great, thank you, Diana. Yeah, so I mean, there's elements of traditional approaches both out there and then both in our own work, and this is what you'll hear now is like part of the results of our own organizational self-reflection on this. And as you can tell throughout the talk, you know, this is a work in progress in many ways, and of course, we're always interested in hearing folks' feedback. So let's talk about the first of the three alternatives that Diana outlined. It's the school quality measures component of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, always a mouthful. A very brief overview of the consortium. We're a group of 8 districts that has come together to try to pilot an alternative to standardized test-based measurement, both measurement of students in the classroom, but also measurement of schools writ large. You can see the districts listed there. Because we include Boston in Massachusetts, the state's largest district, about 1 out of every 10 students in Massachusetts is in an MCIEA school. So I'll tell you a little bit about the School Quality Measures Project, which is one of the primary components of the consortium work. This was developed about 4 years ago in our pilot districts. The School Quality Measures Framework, you see the 5-part framework there, is based on the review of, or our review of public polling and empirical research. And we also conducted interviews and focus groups with folks in our pilot districts to just ask people the same question that we asked you all in the connections at the start. What do you want your children to get out of school? What's most important to you about school? And of course, we heard things not unlike what folks shared in the chat: collaboration, student voice, engagement, inclusiveness. All of these different components of school quality are organized under the 5 categories you see there. The 3 on the outside: teachers and leadership, school culture, and resources. Those are the inputs, and the sort of outputs are, you know, traditional academic learning, of course, but also community and well-being. Our final framework has 34 unique measures that fall underneath one of those 5 categories. Of course, if folks want more information afterwards, you'll have my email address at the end of the presentation. I'm always happy to reach out. So let's walk through a few quick examples of what SQM data collection looks like. So there's a lot of text on this slide, which I apologize for. I'll walk us through it. On the left side, you'll see our 3 primary data collection sources. We collect administrative data from schools. So for example, the percent of teachers teaching 5 years or more, counselor to student ratio. Overall, there's about 30 administrative data items that we collect. We also survey students in grades 4 through 12. That survey is translated into 9 languages. And we also conduct teacher surveys, both with classroom teachers and specialists. And we use those 3 data sources to get at or to understand better the school quality measures that I showed you in the previous slide. So I have a few examples of those on the right. Student sense of belonging is something that I saw in the chat, and something that we're focused on getting a sense of in our teacher and student surveys. We'll ask teachers about how respectful are students to each other, how much do students at the school care about each other. Then there are sort of parallel questions in the student survey to try to get at this, of course, critical aspect of student learning and students' experience at school that could not be measured in a standardized test. in a minute, Ashley will talk about how we want to translate that into a observation rubric so that we can triangulate survey data against what we're seeing in visits to schools when visits to schools are possible again. I'll before turning it over to Ashley, briefly talk about how we display data on the SQM dashboard. So all of the consortium schools have access to our dashboard. You see a color-coded bar there that takes the mean survey result from any particular survey scale. Just to stay consistent with it, we're showing sense of belonging there. As you can see, there isn't a simplified you're a 7 out of 10 in this scale. We have a box that outlines like the confidence interval of about where a school would be based on the data that we've collected. And then we have various zones to indicate where a school is in its sort of like process of nurturing whatever this thing is, nurturing student sense of belonging. So the green box that you see there is sort of like the approval zone. That's like where you would expect to be, or where a student or a school leader would want its school to be. Then the shaded green is like ideal. The like if like a small percentage of schools would get into that level of a school rating. And then the growth, watch, and warning zones are respectively 1 year away from the green zone, 2 years away, 3 years away. And again, these boundaries were all determined through conversations with our school leaders. You can see the data dashboard has the data display for all of our constructs. So a similar bar for each of the 34 things that we measure. You can see that on the MCIA dashboard, which is right there, the results from Boston are public. And pretty soon we're working with a tech company currently to allow us to display our results in racial disaggregation so that you could get at the equity question even more directly. So those are our primary data sources, and as I mentioned earlier, we will be we're working currently to expand to a fourth system of data collection, school walkthroughs, and I'll turn it over to Ashley to talk about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. So as Peter had mentioned previously, the SQM framework currently draws from data sources like student and teacher surveys, as well as administrative data. We have recently begun the process of developing a walkthrough tool for SQM. So our walkthrough tool aims to understand what the SQM framework looks like in practice. We want to better understand how school communities implement the SQM framework in the school setting. We want to provide clear depictions of what the SQM framework looks like in practice, and for the walkthrough tool to serve as an internal benchmark for the SQM team in understanding how the SQM framework aligns with practice in consortium schools. So sort of as a process of triangulation to validate our data. So our approach in developing this tool, and more specifically the observation items it will include, has been to review existing walkthrough tools for observation items that fit the various constructs within the SQM framework, to look at the literature to identify potential observation items, and to prioritize research that considers or explicitly looks at marginalized student groups. So if we take a look at one of our constructs, student sense of belonging, which Peter had mentioned earlier, this measure draws on anonymous student reports, including 5 survey questions from students, and anonymous teacher reports, including 4 survey questions about the degree to which students feel understood, supported, and accepted by students and adults at their school. On the right, you can see 2 sample questions from our student survey. So in developing an observation tool for this construct, we are essentially trying to answer the question, how can we observe how students feel? So for this particular construct, we looked at the literature. And in looking at the literature, we looked at the items researchers looked for when they are observing students' sense of belonging. And again, because it's not possible to directly observe how someone feels, these items are rooted in student behavior associated with a sense of belonging. For example, students are comfortable asking clarifying questions and for help when they do not understand. Students exhibit willingness to participate in classroom activities and a sense of social cohesion in the classroom. In alignment with our aim to center equity, we prioritize literature that centers historically marginalized groups. So, for example, some of the literature we looked at Latinx students' sense of belonging in advanced placement and honors classes, and also special education students' sense of belonging in inclusive mainstream classrooms. And now is it back to you, Diana?
It is, yeah. And I apologize, I hadn't forwarded that last slide for you.
Not a problem.
So thank you, Peter and Ashley, for laying out the SQM side of this. We wanted to have this presentation include both the work in SQM and the work in building for equity, because school design or redesign is or at least needs to be complementary to the assessment of how it's going to support students, never more so than in the idea of working for true equity, particularly thinking about schools that can be built to disrupt the systems of oppression that exist in them. And so, building for equity is a separate standalone tool to some extent, but it was designed with SQM in mind so that there would be alignment between these two tools so that we would be working in our organization in such a way that would be supporting both of these things. So our why for building for equity was that, we believe that well-implemented student-centered learning can lead to greater achievement for all students, especially students of color and low-income students facing barriers. But if the school design process does not include an explicit equity lens, then that student-centered innovation will just wind up replicating many of the same inequitable outcomes that it's attempting to replace or disrupt. But if you add in that emphasis on culturally sustaining practices, it starts to move the needle a little bit more. And a huge part of this is an inclusive process, and it includes learning on behalf of all the educators and leaders in the building and beyond the building. And it involves collaboration across the community, but it also includes a really careful self-assessment of the data that's there in your district. And when I say data, I mean that very broadly, about what is and isn't working, and specifically for those students who are traditionally marginalized in the schools. So I want to stop for a really quick second and own something, because this is critical to building for equity. This idea of an inclusive school redesign process, it hinges on the idea that you're elevating and including the voices of those who have been marginalized. Right now, you see our three faces, and we are all, white identifying educator, researcher types. I do want to note that although we happen to be the three in this workshop, this would not exist, or it would not exist successfully, if we weren't also engaging with, as collaborators, partners in this work, with many people who don't look like us, with many people who walk in different walks in their school communities, and with many colleagues who bring amazing assets, who who bring those skills and who bring a different perspective coming out of different racial, socioeconomic, and role related identities. I say that simply because that is so essential to a design, and I wanted to name it right in this presentation. That I'm not here as the representative or the expert on equity. I'm here to share something with you that was co-developed in a collaborative way. But anyway, this process includes these culturally responsive design principles, working very closely with and in tandem with an intersection of sort of the self and systems work. So that internal work that needs to happen, that research has shown is critical to helping educators really move the needle in their own practices. Similarly, there's a community-driven process, this equitable redesign cycle, that is an iterative way for schools to continually improve. And ultimately, our hope is that when these three things are working together, the school can move towards more equitable student outcomes. This guide includes a lot of things. We talked to students. We looked at case studies of schools that have moved the needle, public schools across the country that have moved the needle for equity for their students. And we combine this all into a guide, a website, and a lot more. So we invite you to check out. I think one of my colleagues is going to drop into the chat the link to our equity guide website. This is completely free and 100% publicly available. You can download the guide, and you can also download the individual tools. You can peruse the website and check out our case studies, the blog entries from students, find out more about the kind of coaching and support that we bring in introducing building for equity in a school or a district. But specifically today, I want to focus on one tool that's most related to the topic, which is this self-assessment for equity. And self-assessment is really different than a lot of what we think about as school quality reviews, which is a cool and collected external group coming into your school wearing business casual to professional clothing and walking around your school with a clipboard. Now, there is a great deal of value in bringing in external perspectives. I think particularly in systems of school systems or schools in which there has been a longstanding history of inequitable outcomes. Sometimes those external perspectives are valuable. I would also say bringing in parents, bringing in students to engage in this process, bringing in educators from the building and from other schools in the district. That can also be a valuable part of the process. But it's really important not to omit the part of the work that is those who are living and working, so to speak, in this sphere, the ones who are part of the school building, the ones who are part of the community, taking part in this self-assessment for equity. We are unabashed in saying that the owners of this self-assessment are going to be the ones who own the change process, and they need to be engaged from a very early point in thinking about what works and what doesn't in their own school buildings. So this self-assessment is built around these 5 principles, which are phrased a little differently, but were built from a lot of the same sources as the SQM subsections or the different areas that SQM looks at. Here we are articulated as culturally proficient teachers and leaders, an inclusive school culture, student-centered academic learning, supportive resources, and engaged community. And we developed a tool that you'll all be able to play with in just a minute that allows school teams or individuals to sit down and think very carefully about their own schools across these principles and determine where their growing edges are, where they're already successful, and where they may need to bring in some help. This is intended to be used by a heterogeneous team of stakeholders at a school site. So ideally, this includes some school leaders, some classroom teachers, people who are specialists or counselors or supportive services, wraparound services, as well as students and parents being really critical partners. However, it can be used by anyone, and you could sit down today and start thinking about a school site that you care about. So we're going to take a minute to actually look at this tool, and I'm hoping that one of my colleagues can add this link to the chat. It's a tiny URL, and it should bring you to this tool. And this is best when used over time to say, hey, in the fall, this is where we scored. Let's work on the areas where we scored the lowest, and then let's look again in the spring and continue to look on a regular basis. Hand in hand with another school quality review process, such as SQM, that includes more external stakeholders, it can be a powerful force for positive change. But I want you to start right now and just kind of get your feet wet. So I'm going to give you we have time for about 4 or 5 minutes to take a look through this tool and pick one of the principles and self-assess a school site that you care about, that you're involved in, that you're invested in, according to the self-assessment tool. I think I'll actually make it 4 minutes because we're running a little behind. So I'll put that on my clock and give you a chance to give it a try. Please add to the chat if you can't access the tool for any reason, and we'll try to help. I'm going to give us just a minute, and I'm going to put up a little timer for us. Okay, having difficulties with my online timer. So I think I will just leave you to do this. I will tell you we have about 3 more minutes to give a look. When the music stops, we'll come back together.
I remember yesterday, trouble was so far away, making castles in the sand. Everyone a different shade, but everybody was the same. When the lion kissed the lamb. So it seems in my dreams, may it be. I'm talking about that good life. I can see all the colors show us what it really means to be beautiful. Remember when the violence stopped and all the doors were left unlocked? And the stranger was your brother. Remember when the bank got sold and everybody took their gold and everybody helped each other. Ooh, so it seems in my dreams, may it be. I'm talking about that good life. I can see all the colors show us what it really means to be beautiful.
All right, that was 4 minutes. So I appreciate your patience and working with me. Speaking of being flexible in my online timer, which I was so excited to share with you, didn't work. So as you were looking through this tool with your own school in mind, or a school that you care about if you're not school-based, I'm curious, as you were thinking about it, what are some things that your schools do well? What are some priority areas for change? And what requires more consideration? going to give us a minute here to see if anybody has anything that kind of stood out to you, any big takeaways that you want to add to the chat. It's okay if you're just still ruminating on it, but I wanted to give the opportunity for you to share any ahas that came to your mind as you were looking at this and thinking about your own school sites. Okay, so I'll give you a chance to keep thinking about and adding to that. We will come together toward the end for Q&A and additional discussion. So feel free to add anything to the chat now, and we'll return to it when we have an opportunity to talk a little later. So we'll skip the share out for the moment. But before we move ahead, I want to remember a couple of key points here. First is that these results were intended to be calibrated across a diverse, inclusive, and equitable team to ensure it reflects the realities of the school. A lot of what Building for Equity really tries to do is to talk about how the way that a group operates, the design team itself is operating, should reflect the desired outcomes. And that means that the group itself needs to have equity of voice. It needs to be inclusive of different perspectives. So that's a critical component that's very different than you sitting and listening to music while you fill out one of them, but hopefully that's a starting point. The other thing is that the school-wide results are best when complemented by some of those classroom level non-evaluative walkthroughs and other sorts of data. So really it works really best in tandem with some of the things that Peter and Ashley were talking about. I also have to give the disclaimer. This doesn't necessarily replace a comprehensive equity audit. It's not intended to. The idea here is to think about school quality in a way that includes equity and might suggest some future areas for growth. And finally, that this tool works best as a way to pre and post assess school conditions and determine priority areas for change, rather than being, let's say, something that's external facing for external audiences to use and engage with. It's really meant for the internal team to think about where they can go from here. Great. So we will move into thinking a little bit about some of the overarching questions that we still have in a minute. I did want to elevate a few things that really informed some of the work in Building for Equity. Our partners in designing the guide were what included Carla Vigil from the Equity Institute out of Rhode Island, and her work and her work with colleagues there became part of our Building for Equity guide. But they also have a really fantastic culturally responsive walkthrough tool that we've been thinking about and looking at as we think about walkthroughs. We also have thought about other tools that can be complementary to this self-assessment. So if you look on our website, which we linked a few minutes ago, there's also an equity audit planning guide. So if you do decide, wow, we need a full equity audit, this can help you think about how to plan for it and where to get info from. The idea here is not necessarily to be a one-stop shop, but to be a starting place that can really be an important toolkit to hold on to through the school design or redesign process. So I think we're going to open it up for a minute for discussion. I'm going to turn it over for a minute first to Ashley to talk to us a little bit about some of the things that we've been thinking about as open questions that I hope might prompt some discussion from you all.
Sure. So throughout the process of developing a school quality review or a walkthrough tool, several questions and tensions have emerged. The first two items that we have on this list have to do with classroom observations. So when you observe a classroom, you can get some really rich qualitative information from these types of visits, especially as pertains to equity and social dynamics. However, the last thing we want to do is alienate educators who are already under a lot of scrutiny and pressure, and we don't want to add to this burden or create a sense that we're rating individual teachers. And likewise for students. I believe Diana mentioned earlier, like the business casual guy with his clipboard. There's already a little bit of tension around that from students and teachers. So we want to be really cognizant of that. The next item, how to observe the unobservable. So this question was demonstrated in the example we talked about earlier about student sense of belonging. And this can be navigated. As you recall, we drew on observation items from the literature, but you want to make sure that you're using validated observation items, and even then just keeping in mind that we aren't actually observing the construct directly. So that's just something to sort of keep in the back of our head. The next item, DK, you don't know what you don't know. So how do we ensure that those participating recognize inequities and have sharp equity lenses? So not every person and every organization is steeped in equity work and all of the different facets of equity work, ourselves included. So just this idea that we need to bring in help, bring in experts as needed. And also sometimes the experts are the people that live inside of the school or the organization. Lastly, who is the audience? So public data versus internal data. So while there's a lot of power in democratizing data and making it publicly available and legible, there is also a concern about oversimplifying data or even misusing data. Peter spoke briefly earlier in the presentation about great schools who have historically sort of mined state accountability data to rate schools. And some researchers have suggested that this practice has even encouraged racial segregation by painting schools that serve students of color in a negative light. So just thinking carefully about how data is shared and how can we make things publicly available and legible for the public to use. Back to you, Diana.
Actually, I think this is Peter.
Oh, back to Peter. Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, it's all good. So we want to open up just for a few minutes for any discussion or reflection about how the tools that we demonstrated today might be useful to you all in the settings that you work in. I want to emphasize that the Building for Equity Guide is a free guide, and we have the link in the chat. And we're always interested in learning more about how folks might use that or are interested in using it. And, in terms of the school quality review walkthroughs, that's still kind of it's an in development tool, and we're interested in any reflection that you all have there. So how can we be helpful to you all? Of course, there's the chat, and if folks also, I believe this is possible, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you if folks would rather speak directly into the Zoom. I'll also note, in case folks haven't seen it, that there's a comment from Brenda who's saying that in her setting, folks are aim to be better informed regarding cultural responsiveness and competency. And of course, this is one of those things, one of those critically important aspects of student learning that may go unsaid in a traditional walkthrough tool that we aim to make more explicit in the various walkthrough tools that we demonstrated today. See that Jamie has a question. Thank you, Jamie, and you are unmuted.
Hi there. I love this self-assessment for equity, and it's definitely geared towards the lens of the educator understanding what they're looking for. Do we have one, at least a self-assessment form that we could have students use in this format?
So for students, so Building for Equity right now does not include a student survey or self-assessment, but it's something that you've kind of nailed on the head, something that I've been thinking about and collaborating with Peter and the team on, because the SQM process does include a comprehensive student survey. So thinking about how to kind of marry the setup of a self-assessment with some of the indicators that are really part of that student survey may be a next step. So not yet, but hopefully that's going to be in the works at some point.
Right. We do a healthy kids survey, and the students that complete that, it's not they don't usually tie it to their academic success. So if it had a better lens or focus on their academic journey as well as their social emotional learning, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think
Thank
that's
you.
a great thing to aspire to, definitely. Any other questions? We have just another minute or so. We're running up pretty tight.
I'll just say quickly that Jamie, if our student surveys could be helpful to you, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to share the skills that we use.
Thank you.
I think we would have loved to have more time to chat and to have this be more interactive, but some of that is the function of moving on to Zoom. That said, please tell us in the chat if you have anything that stood out as a wow today, or any wonderings, anything you're still wondering about. You can include your email address, and we'll save the chat if you have a specific question, or you can reach out to us via email. We'll include our addresses on the next slide if anything is still outstanding. We just love to have this opportunity to hear from you and what stood out to you or what you're still thinking about. So I'll give you a second, but I also want to elevate a couple of ways to get in touch with us. So please feel free to reach out to any of us via email, or in the case of myself and Peter, we're also on Twitter. The equity guide that you were chatted earlier today is yet that you might need. But it is still probably going to be useful to you. And then finally, MCIEA, which is the organization of districts that CCE helps to facilitate, also has a website that you can check out and learn a little bit more about the school quality measures, as well as some of the other work toward more innovative education assessment. And they have a Twitter account as well. And finally, please feel free to check out our org, CCE. Before you go today, oops, I am out of presentation mode for some reason. Okay, before you go today, we also want to thank you for joining us and invite you to take the 1-minute poll that Jessica from Aurora Institute just added to the chat. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on how today went. With that, on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank you for attending this workshop. It was wonderful to interact with you all and think about how we can make school quality reviews stronger and more equitable. So thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone.